Hi, everyone. My name is Aidan Wright from the University of North Florida, and this is my Voice of the People essay titled Retreat from Communism. So let's get started. December 7th, 1941, a day which, as Franklin Delano Roosevelt famously said, will live in infamy. As we all know, this was the day that the Japanese Empire attacked the United States at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, and caused the United States to get involved with World War II with the Axis powers. After 4 long years in the war, the United States had declared victory, and the United States had a feeling of being the most powerful nation in the world. But this feeling of greatness would soon be short-lived because of a new conflict arising with its former ally, the Soviet Union. This new conflict was called the Cold War, and this would last from 1947 to 1991. It was dubbed the Cold War due to the lack of action between the United States and the Soviet Union, but there were proxy wars like Korea and Vietnam. But for decades, the United States and the Soviet Union would fight over global dominance, which left people around the world in fear of another World War III. The piece of art that I will be focusing my writing on is the Retreat Diaries by William S. Burroughs. The reason I am choosing to focus on this piece is the color of the picture and the title of this photo. Primarily, the background color of this photo is white, but everything else in it is red. The painting is showing a man who looks to be standing in the middle of a field, and the color of everything is red. So, as a historian, my first initial reaction was communism in the Cold War. As I mentioned earlier, the Cold War lasted from 1947 to 1991, and this piece of artwork was created in 1976. Then when I look at the title, the main word that stuck out to me is retreat. During the 1970s, the Cold War started to ease up a little bit compared to the 2 previous decades. During the 50s and 60s, there was a high threat of nuclear war, and it caused Americans and Europeans to panic. In the United States, there were nuclear shelters and nuclear bomb drills because there was a high chance the Soviet Union would launch missiles here. When people go to work during the week, they get there mainly by taking the highway. What people don't know is that the highway was created by President Eisenhower because of the Cold War. The highway system was a system used to transport nuclear weapons around America and for evacuation routes. I say all of this to show that most people around the world did not even think that we'd make it to the 1970s, and we were really concerned about this. Newsflash, society made it to the 1970s, an era of political upheaval. Correspondingly to what I said earlier, the 1970s saw the Cold War enter into a period of détente. If you don't know, détente is the easing of hostility, so this is why when I look at the word retreat in the title, I think of it as the United States retreating from the Cold War. To illustrate, at the start of the decade, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty comes into effect. The treaty was an agreement between 191 states to use nuclear energy peacefully and to have nuclear disarmament. This was a huge victory for society because we were so close to having nuclear war with the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. This agreement was the predecessor of the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks 1 and 2, which was between the Soviet Union and the United States. This treaty had a larger impact because this agreement was between the 2 superpowers of the world who had the most nuclear weapons. If you go back 2 decades to Harry S. Truman and Joseph Stalin, I doubt that they would have been able to come up with such a treaty like this one. This example goes back to my point of retreat because both of these countries are retreating from their old hostile ways. Even outside the United States and the Soviet Union, retreat from the Cold War was taking place in other places like in Asia and Europe, namely the signing of the Paris Peace Accords, which formally ended the Vietnam War. However, some Americans did not agree with this and were in fact infuriated with this treaty because they wanted communism contained. But on the other hand, since there was a lot more protest against the war, this caused Nixon to finally pull out of this war. Speaking of Nixon, he visited China and talked with Mao Zedong, who was the communist leader at the time, which led to better relations between China and the United States. Once again, if you go back 2 decades earlier, the United States was at war with China during the Korean War, which was one of the proxy wars of the Cold War. So once again, this shows the retreat of the old hostile ways. People around the world weren't on such high alert like they were during the previous 2 decades. Likewise, on the European side, Poland and West Germany in 1970 signed a non-aggression pact. Small treaties like this shows how countries are trying to change their current relation. Thus, when I look at the artwork of the Retreat Diaries by William S. Burroughs, I think of the Cold War and how the tensions were starting to ease throughout the 1970s. As a historian, I honestly never thought I'd see the end of the Cold War due to the mass weapon consumption and the multiple threats such as the Cuban Missile Crisis. If I was alive during those times, I would not have any hope of growing old. But we did eventually see the end of it. So it is interesting how I am able to look at this piece of artwork and relate it to the topic while other people probably related it to something else. Now, this is my author's note and bio. Hello, whoever may be reading this essay. My name is Aidan Wright, and I am currently a sophomore at the University of North Florida. I am from Jacksonville, Florida, and I am a history major. History has been something that I've loved since the start of middle school. I believe that this love started from my granddad, who grew up in the Jim Crow South and told me his stories about life growing up. So this is the main reason why I decided to write this essay about something related to history. In this essay, I want the author to be able to see all of the knowledge I possess when it comes to history, and maybe even in this writing, everyone who reads this could maybe learn something new. And that is it, guys, from my essay on Voice of the People and my author's note to go along with it. Thank you for listening to it, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.
My retreat journey. The dry air and sand pressed into my skin, but I can still hear the waves crashing in the distance. Whether it was day or night, the waves retreat, escaping from the land. Observe how the waves crash and take away from the surface their claimed perfection lying in the depth of the ocean. There's always been something intimate about watching water and land continuously meet naturally. It almost makes people forget the dangers beneath the surface. Dangers have proven to be everywhere, yet everyone focuses more internally. Internally, there are the aspects that make that person the center of attention in their own world. Being limited to our own views gives a self-eccentric world, since we choose the value placed on actions, relationships, decisions, etc. Like the waves crashing onto themselves, we wonder where the summer has gone. Whether physically, digitally, or mentally, dialogue in our minds of the ideal summer and what happened proves that life does not always go our way. I learned this during my spring break in the year 2020. These are my retreat diaries. Whether we are having a connection with another person, connecting online, or mentally getting to know ourselves better, the thoughts and dialogue that follow into our ideal season or expectations proves that life will not go to an individualized plan. For me, it started spring break 2020. I spent most of the break sleeping. I was in my sophomore year and the stress from high school was overwhelming. The number of sleepless nights and painful evenings felt never ending until I had a break. Staying in contact with my friends while we did our own things was more difficult than ever. I was never one to watch the news, since it is usually about sad things or politics. I believe it was too early or too late in the day to care. I was aimlessly scrolling on my phone until my friend, and later mother, informed me that spring break was extended. In the moment, that was exciting, considering school felt more like a drag and was not catered to my interests. However, the excitement was short-lived, as it was within the height of the pandemic. The pandemic flipped around everything I knew and I had taken for granted. The connection to social media and being online grew tremendously. Trends changed quickly and attention spans got decimated. I was no exception. It was as if life had been paused and we were locked in a cage being brainwashed with a tsunami of news in a desert of communication. In the beginning of the pandemic, media was the only consistent in the virtual world. Everyone was informed to remain in their homes and were subjected to curfews. The days were indistinguishable from rolling out of bed to rolling back into bed, hoping for a different outcome. Eventually, it became the norm that I remained ignorant to the news. This rule was implemented by my mother. She worried that the stress would get to me and impede my progress in school. The news was filled with overfilled hospitals, minimal direction on how to handle the virus if you were sick, implying everyone should isolate, shipments to grocery stores were limited. Before I knew it, it was summer. But it flew by quickly since it felt like every other day. Screen time was at an all-time high, to the point being separated from your phone was too much to bear. Being able to function without technology was too much. On my phone, I was constantly on YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram. I was continuously being on my phone, watching or rewatching the same videos over and over. It gave comfort in those times that were difficult to explain. As quickly as summer came, it left, and a choice had to be made: continue with online school or go back in person. This was unfamiliar because the idea of in person made me anxious and filled with the fears of an uncertain future. I decided to stay online, as it was my norm. I'd become accustomed to my routine and had no intention of changing it if I didn't have to. Arrangements needed to be made that I would attend every class, that I would complete all assignments in a timely manner. My parents had faith in my abilities, considering the signed agreement that I would not miss class nor let my grades slip below a certain point. The penalty for doing so would mean I need to go back in person to those classes. Fear became my motivator. According to a friend who decided to go back in person, many of our peers had chosen to remain online. It was a learning preference, it seemed. However, online learning was more flexible this way. After the first quarter, a few were forced to go back since they were not abiding by the agreement of attendance or grades. Once we were halfway through the academic year, nearly everyone had returned in person. It made me realize how isolating it was to be home, even if you reached out virtually. Many were struggling to keep up with the pace in person. It was my exact fear, adjusting back into what society used to be like. Before the pandemic, before online school, before our days blended, was an impossible feat. To make light of it, I consider these 2 years as the years of passion and entrepreneurship. There are negative side effects of consuming as much media as we did. However, I now consider this isolation from others a positive outcome. The exposition of media promoting hobbies ranging from candle making to crocheting. Also, awareness of dealing with mental health content was pushed heavily during this time, explaining the importance of relaxing and breaks. Prior to this part of my life, I considered my mental health to be out of sight, out of mind. The influences I knew my whole life prioritized working over their health. Not to mention, school had not given me awareness of its importance before then. Now I understand the importance of pursuing your wants over others' expectations. Rather than living to work, you are working to live. My name is Kiela Jefferson. I am an English major concentrated in creative writing. After looking through all the artwork, I chose the Retreat Diaries. My first thought was how the books are called a getaway, and go with that idea. However, when I looked up what the retreat diaries were about, I discovered it was a collection of journal entries made by Burroughs during the summer of 1975. This had given me the idea of what year impacted me the most and where my mentality shifted. Thanks for listening.